Hillman sets a screen, rolls to the basket. Gray.
Welcome back to Clark USA fans. Nobody was supposed to talk about this. Not like this. Not on camera. Not out loud. This was the kind of story that usually stays buried behind locker room doors, whispered between insiders, brushed aside with polite press conference answers and carefully crafted statements. But something different happened in San Juan, Puerto Rico, during the 2026 FIBA Women's World Cup qualifiers. Something cracked. And once it did, there was no putting it back together quietly. What started as a routine international window quickly turned into one of the most talked about moments in modern women's basketball. A head coach stepping away mid-tournament. An interim voice taking control. Rotations changing overnight. A system shifting in real time. And in the center of it all, one name that the entire basketball world could not ignore anymore, Caitlin Clark. Because what unfolded wasn't just about wins and losses. It wasn't just about chemistry or experimentation. It was about a question that had been building for months. How do you contain a generational player inside a system that isn't built for her? And more importantly, what happens when you finally stop trying? At first, everything looked normal on the surface. Team USA arrived in Puerto Rico with expectations as high as ever. This wasn't just another tournament, it was the introduction of a new era. A new coaching staff. A new wave of superstars. A new cycle leading toward the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. The foundation was being laid, and every decision mattered. To understand why everything exploded the way it did, you have to rewind to December 2025, inside a training facility in Durham, North Carolina. That's where Caitlin Clark reported for her first official camp with the senior national team. This wasn't a symbolic invite. This wasn't hype. This was real. A transition moment. The beginning of her journey at the highest level of international basketball. USA Basketball had just made a major change. A new leader stepped in to guide the program into the future. The coaching staff was stacked, experienced, respected, deeply connected to the professional game. On paper, it looked perfect. A dream team of basketball minds, all tasked with managing the most talented roster in the world. But what doesn't show up on paper is history. Because many of these coaches weren't meeting these players for the first time. There were past seasons, past decisions, past frustrations, especially when it came to Clark. Relationships that had already been tested under pressure. Philosophies that didn't always align. And while everything looked united from the outside, underneath, there were questions that hadn't been fully answered. At the center of those questions was Clark herself. She didn't arrive in Durham as the unstoppable force fans had seen before. She arrived after one of the most difficult stretches of her career. The 2025 WNBA season had taken a lot out of her, physically and mentally. Injuries limited her to just 13 games. 13. For a player who had built her identity on consistency, rhythm, and relentless production, that number wasn't just low, it was devastating. An ankle injury disrupted her early season. A groin issue followed and made everything worse. Her movement was affected. Her explosiveness wasn't the same. The quick first step that defenders feared wasn't always there. The confidence that came naturally had to be rebuilt, piece by piece. Instead of dominating on the court, she spent most of the year recovering, training rooms, rehab sessions, stationary bikes. Watching instead of playing. And maybe the hardest part? Watching her team succeed without her. That kind of experience changes a player. It forces reflection. It forces growth. And when Clark walked into that December camp, she wasn't just trying to prove she was still elite. She was trying to prove she was fully back. Inside that controlled environment, the signs were encouraging. She was working closely with the medical staff, rebuilding strength, regaining trust in her body. Every drill, every rep, every movement, it all mattered. And slowly, the rhythm returned. The confidence followed. By the time cameras caught glimpses of practice, she looked different. Not just healthy, but focused. Locked in. Determined. She even admitted it herself. She felt better than she had in months. Like her body was finally catching up to her mind again. But while her game was coming back to life, another question was quietly growing in the background. How would she actually be used? Because talent alone doesn't guarantee opportunity. Not in a system built on balance. Not in a program that values structure above everything else. And not when the coaching philosophy is centered on experimentation rather than domination. That question didn't fully reveal itself until March 2026, when Team USA arrived in San Juan. Technically, this tournament wasn't supposed to be high pressure. The team had already secured qualification. These games were meant to be preparation, fine-tuning lineups, building chemistry, testing combinations. But the reality felt completely different. Because this wasn't just any roster. This was the first time three of the biggest names in the sport, Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, and Paige Buchers, were stepping onto the international stage together at the senior level. The hype was massive. The attention was global. Fans filled arenas. Social media exploded. Every move was analyzed. Every possession mattered. And right away, something felt off. The system in place was methodical, structured, almost mechanical. Rotations were predetermined. Substitutions came in waves. Entire lineups changed at once, regardless of rhythm or momentum. It wasn't about riding the hot hand. It wasn't about letting a player take over. It was about equal opportunity, controlled evaluation. And in that system, Clark wasn't the focal point. She wasn't even starting. Instead, she was placed in the second unit, coming off the bench, sharing minutes in a rotation that didn't prioritize her strengths. Meanwhile, the veteran core handled the opening stretches of games, setting the tone in a way that felt safe, but not necessarily explosive. The reaction was immediate. Fans noticed. Analysts questioned it. The energy shifted. Because this wasn't just any player being limited. This was a generational talent, someone who had already proven she could change the pace of an entire game by herself. And yet, she was being asked to fit into a system that didn't revolve around her. At first, the team still won. The structure held. The results looked fine on paper. But something underneath wasn't clicking. Because basketball isn't just about systems. It's about feel. It's about rhythm. It's about recognizing when a player is capable of taking over and letting them do it. And slowly, quietly, that realization started to build. Every possession where Clark created something out of nothing. Every moment where the offense suddenly came alive when she had the ball. Every stretch where the pace changed, where defenders scrambled, where the game just felt different. You could see it. The contrast was undeniable. And once that contrast became too obvious to ignore, everything changed. Because the biggest mistake a system can make is trying to control something that was never meant to be controlled. And in San Juan, for the first time, that truth wasn't just visible. It was impossible to ignore.
And then breaking it open, especially in the second half.
The most talked about player in the sport wasn't stepping onto the court for the opening tip. She was sitting on the sideline, watching it unfold from a folding chair. Let that sink in for a second. The player whose name was driving record-breaking viewership, the one filling arenas across cities and continents, the one fans were traveling thousands of miles to see live, wasn't even in the starting lineup. Caitlin Clark, the face of this new era, began her international journey not at center stage, but from the bench. And yet, what made this story so powerful wasn't the decision itself, it was how she responded to it. Because Clark didn't complain. She didn't show frustration publicly. She didn't let the moment turn into a distraction. She handled it the way elite players do, by letting her game speak louder than any headline ever could. In that very first game, coming off the bench against Senegal, she delivered a performance that didn't just meet expectations, it shattered them. 17 points. 12 assists. Numbers that didn't just stand out, they broke international debut benchmarks for USA basketball. But even those numbers didn't fully capture what she did on the court. Because this wasn't just production, it was transformation. The moment Clark stepped onto the floor, the entire structure of the offense shifted. The pace changed. The spacing expanded. Passing lanes that didn't exist suddenly opened up. Defenders who were comfortable just moments before were now scrambling, reacting instead of controlling. It was like someone flipped a switch. She didn't just contribute to the system, she rewrote it in real time. After the game, the coaching staff acknowledged what everyone had just witnessed. Clark was praised as one of the most dynamic playmakers in the world. Her ability to elevate teammates, to create opportunities out of nothing, to control the tempo, everything was recognized. And yet, despite all of that, nothing changed. Game 2 came, this time against Puerto Rico, and the same rotation-heavy system remained in place. The same structure, the same substitutions, the same limitations. Clark once again came off the bench, and once again, she delivered. 12 points, 5 assists. Efficient, controlled, impactful. Another performance that clearly stood above the flow of the game itself. But still, the system didn't adjust. That's when the conversation shifted. It wasn't just about performance anymore, it became about purpose. Fans weren't just confused, they were frustrated. Social media exploded with reactions. Analysts started asking tougher questions. And one question kept coming back, louder with every passing game. Why? Why was the most electrifying player on the floor being placed in a role that restricted her influence? Why build a system that neutralizes the very advantage that makes your team unstoppable? Why hold back the one player who clearly changes everything the moment she touches the ball? And then, just as the tension reached its peak, everything changed. Now, this is the part of the story that people will debate for years, because how you frame it matters. Officially, the coaching transition had already been planned. The head coach had dual responsibilities, balancing international duties with a major college tournament run. When those obligations required her full attention, she stepped away from the team during the qualifying window. On paper, it was procedural. Expected. Nothing unusual. But what happened next didn't feel procedural at all. An assistant coach stepped into the interim role. And almost immediately, the team looked different. Gone was the rigid, mechanical rotation system. Gone were the wholesale substitutions that ignored rhythm and momentum. Gone was the predetermined hierarchy that kept certain players locked into roles regardless of performance. In its place came something far more familiar, real basketball. The kind of basketball where minutes are earned, not assigned. Where impact determines opportunity. Where the flow of the game dictates decisions. And most importantly, where your best players are allowed to be exactly that, your best players. And the first person to feel that shift was Caitlin Clark. The turning point came against Italy. Early in the game, the starting unit struggled. The offense looked stagnant. Predictable. Italy's defense packed the paint, cut off driving lanes, and forced difficult perimeter shots. The ball wasn't moving with purpose. The energy wasn't there. For the first few minutes, it felt like a team searching for answers. And then, the call came from the bench. Clark checked in. What happened next didn't just change the game, it changed the entire narrative of the tournament. In just over 6 minutes of action, Clark orchestrated a scoring explosion that flipped everything on its head. Team USA erupted for 23 points during her stretch on the floor. 23.
Speaking of X Factors, Ariel Atkins off balance.
To put that into perspective, the starting group had managed just 5 points before she entered. That's not a small difference. That's not a coincidence. That's a statement. The court looked completely different the moment she took control. Italy's defense, which had been organized and confident, suddenly looked overwhelmed. Rotations were late. Closeouts were rushed. Passing lanes opened faster than they could react. The pick and roll became unstoppable. Every possession carried purpose. Every movement had intent. Clark finished the game with solid numbers, 12 points, 5 assists, but again, the stats only told part of the story. Because what really mattered was the shift. The feeling, the undeniable reality that this team operated on a completely different level when she was running the offense. And for the first time, that reality was fully acknowledged. At the post-game podium, the interim coach didn't hide behind vague language or safe explanations. He didn't deflect. He didn't dress it up in diplomatic phrasing. Instead, he did something rare. He told the truth. Not in a confrontational way. Not by criticizing anyone directly. but by clearly stating what the team needed moving forward, defined roles, structured responsibilities, and a system built around maximizing elite talent, not distributing minutes evenly. It was subtle, but powerful. Because in a single statement, he confirmed what fans, analysts, and even the games themselves had been showing all along. The previous system wasn't unlocking Clark's full potential. And once that truth was out in the open, there was no going back. From that moment forward, everything changed. The next game against New Zealand marked a new chapter. For the first time in the tournament, Caitlin Clark wasn't coming off the bench. She was in the starting lineup. From the opening tip, the difference was immediate and overwhelming. Team USA didn't just win, they dominated. A 101-46 blowout that showcased exactly what this team could be when fully optimized. Clark controlled the game with confidence, dictating tempo, creating opportunities, and making every player around her better. 14 points. Perfect from the free throw line. 6 assists. Efficient. Commanding. Complete. But again, it wasn't just about the numbers. The offense flowed. Players moved with purpose. Cuts were sharper. Spacing was cleaner. Decisions were quicker. It felt like a machine, consistent, adaptive, and nearly impossible to stop. And at the center of it all was Clark, no longer trying to force her impact into limited minutes, but setting the tone from the very beginning. For the first time, she looked fully at home. And everyone watching could see it. Even casual fans who hadn't been following closely noticed the difference. This wasn't just a lineup adjustment, it was a complete identity shift. A declaration of what this team could be when it stopped holding back and started embracing its most dynamic weapon. But the evolution didn't stop there. Later in the tournament, another move sent shockwaves across the basketball world. A pairing fans had been waiting for finally became reality: Caitlin Clark and Paige Bueckers sharing the backcourt together. 2 generational playmakers. 2 elite scorers. 2 players capable of creating from anywhere on the floor. Vision. Shooting range. Basketball IQ. Creativity. All combined in one lineup. And the result? Pure chaos for the opposing defense. Because now, it wasn't just about stopping one player. It was about surviving 2. Double one and the other takes over. Collapse the paint and shooters are wide open. Pressure the ball and passes cut through the defense like precision strikes. It wasn't just effective, it was overwhelming. The ball moved faster. The reads came quicker. The defense had no time to adjust. Possessions became unpredictable in the best possible way. And once again, the entire identity of the team elevated. What started as a quiet question in December had turned into a loud, undeniable answer in San Juan. When you stop limiting greatness, it doesn't just show up. It takes over. When Caitlin Clark and Paige Bueckers finally shared the floor together, it wasn't just a lineup change, it was a glimpse into the future of basketball. These weren't just 2 great players operating side by side. These were 2 minds seeing the game at a level most professionals don't even reach. Both of them capable of reading plays before they fully developed, identifying passing angles that defenders didn't even realize existed, and executing decisions in real time with a precision that made defenses look a step behind on every single possession. What unfolded wasn't just effective offense, it was an offensive clinic that bordered on unfair. Because when those 2 were on the court together, the entire math of defense broke down. Every traditional rule, help defense, rotations, collapsing the paint, suddenly came with a cost that teams couldn't afford to pay. Leave Clark for even a split second, and she's launching from deep or slicing into the lane. Shift attention toward her, and Bueckers is standing in space, ready to create or score. Try to contain Bueckers, and Clark suddenly has a clear runway to attack the basket or dissect the defense with a pass. There was no correct answer, only consequences. Driving lanes opened automatically. The paint became accessible in ways that simply weren't possible earlier in the tournament. The spacing stretched defenses to their breaking point. And what made it even more devastating was the speed at which decisions were being made. This wasn't slow, methodical offense. It was rapid, instinctive, relentless execution. Every possession forced defenders into impossible choices, and every hesitation turned into an opportunity. This wasn't theory. This wasn't projection. This was evidence, clear, visible, undeniable. The kind of evidence that doesn't need debate, doesn't require advanced analytics breakdowns, doesn't rely on opinions. Anyone watching could see it. And more importantly, the coaching staff saw it too. But what separated the interim approach from what came before was how that evidence was treated. Instead of labeling the Clark-Buchers pairing as a temporary experiment or an interesting option to revisit later, it was embraced as a real weapon. Something to be used strategically, confidently, and without hesitation. It wasn't about testing anymore, it was about maximizing. About recognizing what works and leaning into it fully. At the same time, it's important to understand the bigger picture, because this situation wasn't as simple as one coach being right and another being wrong. The initial approach taken earlier in the tournament wasn't rooted in bias or some hidden agenda. It came from a philosophy, one that has been used by elite international programs for years. The early stages of a competition cycle are often about evaluation, figuring out which players fit together, understanding different combinations, building a foundation that can sustain success not just for one tournament, but for years to come. And with a roster full of elite players coming from different teams, different systems, and different roles, that kind of evaluation does carry value. There was logic behind rotating players, behind experimenting with lineups, behind spreading minutes across the roster to gather as much information as possible. This wasn't random, it was structured, intentional, and aligned with how many championship-level programs operate when building towards something bigger, like a World Cup or the Olympics. And throughout all of it, Clark wasn't being ignored. She was praised consistently, recognized as a generational talent, acknowledged for her ability to elevate the pace and energy of the offense every time she stepped on the floor. But praise and utilization are not the same thing. And that's where the disconnect became impossible to ignore. Because no matter how sound the philosophy might have been, the results on the court told a different story. A clearer story. One that showed a gap, not in talent, not in effort, but in how that talent was being deployed. And that's where the interim approach shifted everything. Operating under a compressed timeline, with less emphasis on long-term evaluation and more focus on immediate performance, the decision-making became simpler. Direct, data-driven, based on what was actually happening in games, not what might happen in the future. And from the very first game, the data had been pointing in one direction. Caitlin Clark needed the ball. Not in controlled bursts, not in limited minutes, but as the central force of the offense. That was the tension at the heart of the entire situation. Two valid philosophies producing completely different outcomes with the exact same roster. One prioritized structure and balance. The other prioritized impact and optimization.
Julie Allemon having herself.
And when those two approaches collided, the difference wasn't subtle. It was dramatic. Naturally, the fan reaction became a major part of the story. When Clark was kept in a limited role early on, social media didn't just react, it exploded. Accusations started flying. Some believed it was favoritism toward veteran players. Others suggested internal conflicts or unresolved tensions from past team dynamics. Every small detail was analyzed: body language on the sideline, interactions between players and coaches, even facial expressions caught on camera. Moments were taken out of context and turned into narratives. Clips went viral. Discussions grew louder. And as often happens in the modern sports landscape, perceptions started to shape reality. Some fans even reached back into previous moments, questioning past roster decisions, revisiting earlier controversies, building a larger storyline that suggested a pattern of Clark being held back. Whether any of those claims had real influence on what was happening in Puerto Rico is something that can't be proven from the outside. But perception doesn't wait for proof. Once people believe something, it takes on a life of its own. And in this case, that perception only grew stronger as the contrast between the two approaches became more visible. What ultimately grounded the conversation wasn't speculation, it was clarity. Not loud, dramatic statements, but measured, direct acknowledgement from the coaching side that adjustments were necessary. That roles needed to be clearer. That systems needed to reflect the strengths of the players on the floor. And from that point forward, the results spoke louder than anything else. Team USA didn't just win, they dominated. A perfect record through the tournament. Massive scoring margins. Consistent control from start to finish. And at the center of it all, Clark delivering at a level that reaffirmed everything people had been saying about her. She led the team in assists, controlled tempo, created opportunities, shot efficiently from deep, and perhaps most importantly, showed that her game had evolved even after a long injury layoff. This wasn't just the same player returning, this was a more complete version. One capable of scoring, facilitating, and competing defensively with a level of consistency that left little room for criticism. These weren't empty stats. They came against organized, disciplined international defenses that specifically game-planned to slow her down. They studied her tendencies. They adjusted their schemes. They tried to limit her influence. It didn't work. And that's what makes this moment so significant. Because now, the conversation is no longer about potential. It's no longer about what might happen if things align. The evidence is already there. The blueprint has already been drawn. And with the World Cup in Berlin on the horizon, everything becomes more intense. The stakes get higher. The margin for error disappears. There's no room for hesitation, no space for uncertainty. Every decision matters. Every adjustment counts. This isn't just about winning games anymore. It's about defining an identity. Will the system fully embrace what it has? Will it evolve to match the talent leading it? Or will it try, once again, to contain something that has already proven it can't be contained? Because Puerto Rico wasn't just a tournament. It was a warning. And Berlin might be something much bigger. When that moment comes, when pressure peaks, when expectations collide with reality, when the future of the game is being shaped in real time, there will be no hiding from the truth. The only question left is simple. When everything is on the line, who adjusts first?